I was dissolving, not dying, not bleeding out on the floor. Just dissolving. Like someone swapped my hand for beach sand and opened their fist. I screamed. Obviously, I screamed. You would too, I promise, if your fingers started drifting apart like smoke on a windy day. My name is Kai, 23 years old, former test subject number 441B at Black Ridge Research Facility, Nevada. 6 minutes ago, a woman in a white coat injected something into my neck and told me with a straight face that this won't hurt a bit. She lied. It hurt an enormous, catastrophic, deeply personal kind of amount that I will be thinking about for the rest of my life. But here is what nobody tells you about dissolving. After the first 30 seconds, it actually stops hurting completely. After 30 seconds, it just feels warm, like standing barefoot in sunlight, like sand between your toes at the beach, which, in hindsight, makes horrifying sense. My left hand was completely gone by now, not bleeding, not cut off, gone like it had simply decided to stop being a hand and become something else. In its place, a small pile of golden sand sat on the clean, white floor of Lab 7, Sector C, Black Ridge Research Facility, somewhere in the Nevada desert. The woman, Dr. Solis, head of Project Sandstorm, was typing calmly on her tablet, not screaming, not running, just taking notes like a professional. I want you to remember that detail, the note-taking, the calm, the complete absence of any normal human reaction to watching a person dissolve. It matters later. Subject is responding ahead of projected timeline, she said into her recorder. Cellular deconstruction beginning at the extremities. Excellent. Excellent. She actually said excellent. I was becoming sand, grain by grain, finger by finger, and her professional assessment was excellent. I made a decision at that exact moment. If I survived whatever this was, Dr. Solis and I were going to have a very long conversation. My arm went next, then my shoulder. But the strange thing was the sand didn't fall to the floor. It floated, hovering in the air right where my arm used to be, like it was waiting, like it still knew it was supposed to be part of me, like it was just taking a different shape, but hadn't actually gone anywhere. And then I felt it, the strangest, most impossible thing I have ever felt in 23 years of being alive and having normal human nerve endings. I felt the sand, not like touching it with my fingers. I felt it the way you feel your own heartbeat, automatic, constant, undeniable. It was still me, just reorganized. Fascinating, Dr. Solis whispered, stepping closer, eyes wide, behind her glasses, pen moving across her tablet without her even looking down at it. Then every alarm in the building went off at once. Red emergency lights flooded the room. Sirens, loud enough to feel in your chest, started screaming. A voice on the intercom announced, "Containment breach in Lab 7. All personnel evacuate immediately. This is not a drill." Dr. Solis stopped typing, and for the first time since I'd met her 14 months ago, she looked genuinely, visibly uncertain about something. She stared at what was left of me, roughly my right side, both legs, and a slowly spinning storm of golden particles filling the air of Lab 7. And then she said 7 words I will never forget for as long as I live. "Oh, that's not supposed to happen yet." Yet, she said yet, not ever, not at all. Yet, which meant it was always supposed to happen, just on a different schedule. Just not today. I need to back up, because you're probably wondering how a 23-year-old ends up as test subject 441B in a classified government research facility in the Nevada desert. Short answer, money. Longer answer, I grew up in a town so small the nearest traffic light was a 40-minute drive away on a good day. My mom worked double shifts at a roadside diner 6 days a week. My dad was gone before I was old enough to have a real memory of his face. We weren't poor in the dramatic movie way where everything is grey and people cry in the rain. We were poor in the quiet way that's harder to explain. The quiet way means you learn early not to want things, not because wanting is wrong, just because wanting things that aren't coming is a specific kind of exhausting you get tired of carrying. So when a man in an expensive suit showed up at our door when I was 19 with a contract and a number that had more zeros than I'd ever seen in real life, I signed it. The contract said voluntary medical research, improving human performance through cutting-edge science. 8 weeks, fully compensated, room and board included. In and out. That was 4 years ago. And just to be extremely, unambiguously clear, those were not vitamins they were testing on me. The first 2 years were almost normal. Blood draws every morning, physical fitness testing, treadmills, cognitive assessments twice a week. They said I was faster than average, stronger than expected. They seemed very pleased with me. I got extra dessert on Fridays as an unspoken reward for good test results. That should have been my first warning. Year 3 is when things started getting genuinely strange. They stopped naming the compounds they were injecting me with and started using numbers instead. Compound 7, Compound 19, Compound 44. Numbers instead of names, which is either a pharmaceutical naming convention or a sign that what's in the needle has no business being in a human body. Compound 44 made my skin feel like it was vibrating for 7 straight days. Not painful. Just a constant, low-level hum, like standing next to a very large speaker playing a frequency you can almost hear. Compound 19 gave me the ability to sense small changes in air pressure, which sounds impressive until you realize it has exactly 0 practical applications in everyday human life. Compound 7 made me glow faintly in the dark for 3 full days. I reported this to the medical team. They looked at their charts and said, within acceptable parameters. I should have walked out after that. The contract had exit clauses. I'd read them 3 times. I knew exactly what I was entitled to. But they kept saying, we're so close to a breakthrough, Kai. Just a little longer. Think about what this means for humanity, Kai. Think about what you're contributing to. And also, every few weeks, here is another deposit in your account, another number with another 0 at the end. Think about your mom's rent. I'm not proud of it, but have you ever been broke? Not vacation budget broke, not new phone can wait broke, the choosing between electricity and groceries kinda broke? The money made it easier to stay, easier to ignore the voice in the back of my head that kept getting louder every month, whispering, something here is very, very wrong. Then came year 4 and Compound 441. They brought me into Lab 7 on a Tuesday, taco day in the facility cafeteria. I'd been genuinely looking forward to it all morning. Instead, I found myself sitting in a medical chair while Dr. Solis explained that Compound 441 was the culmination of everything they had been building toward for the past 4 years. A complete cellular restructuring agent, she called it. It would bond with my DNA at a level no other compound had achieved. It would make me something extraordinary, she said. She said it like she was describing a promotion, like being turned into something extraordinary was the natural next step after 4 years of good performance reviews. I said, can I please have some time to think about this? She looked at me. Then she looked at the 2 very large men standing quietly by the door. I stopped asking questions. The needle went into my neck at exactly 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, and I never got my tacos. Out of everything that has happened to me since that moment, that is still the part that bothers me most. Okay, back to Lab 7. Back to the alarms and the red lights, and Dr. Solis standing against the wall saying, that's not supposed to happen yet, still holding her tablet like a shield. By the time the evacuation order finished playing over the intercom, I was approximately 40% sand and 60% a confused 23-year-old having the worst Tuesday of his life. The 40% that was still flesh and bone was panicking in a very traditional, very human way. The 60% that was now floating golden particles was doing something different. It was exploring, pressing against the walls, testing the air currents, mapping the room. A curiosity that didn't feel like mine, and also felt completely, undeniably like mine. Dr. Solis had backed against the far wall now, tablet clutched to her chest, watching me with an expression I was trying to read and couldn't quite pin down. Not fear. Not exactly. More like someone watching an experiment succeed so far beyond their projections that they don't have a framework for it yet and are quietly building one in real time. Kai, she said, very slowly and very carefully, the exact tone of voice you use when you're not sure if the large, unpredictable thing in front of you understands language. Can you hear me? I could hear her. I could also hear the ventilation system in the ceiling. I could feel the footsteps of people running in the hallway through vibrations in the floor and walls. I could sense the exact dimensions of Lab 7 because my sand was simultaneously pressing against every single surface in the room at once. I knew this space better than I ever had as a person standing in it. "Yes," I said, or tried to say. What actually came out sounded like wind moving through a slot canyon, the right shape of a word, but made of entirely the wrong material. Dr. Solis wrote something down. Then she looked up and said, with complete seriousness, "I need you to remain calm." This was, without any competition whatsoever, the funniest thing anyone has ever said to me in my entire life. I was 80% sand. I was hovering. I had become a weather event. "I am extremely calm," I said in my new wind-through canyon voice, and I meant it, which was maybe the strangest part of all. Then the wall exploded, not dramatically, just practically, concrete blowing inward in chunks, dust everywhere, a gap appearing where solid wall used to be. Through the gap came 6 figures in full tactical gear, black armor, face shields, weapons I didn't recognize, pointed directly and specifically at me, not at the scientist against the wall, at me. "Target acquired," said the one in front. "Prepare containment canisters." Containment canisters. They had brought containers designed to hold me. They had planned for this. I had just enough functioning human brain left to register that this was very, very bad. The rest of me, the sand, the growing cloud of increasingly aware golden particles, registered something simpler. It got angry. Not a decision, not a choice. The way a storm gets angry, which is to say it doesn't decide anything, it just becomes what it already was, only more so and all at once. The sand-filling Lab 7 moved. 6 figures in tactical gear discovered that their formation and their weapons and their containment canisters were not designed for an opponent with no fixed physical location. "Subject is hostile," one of them shouted into a radio, which I felt was an unfair characterization of someone who had simply decided not to be put in a canister. "Requesting immediate backup." The sand found every crack and seam in Lab 7. I was through. Into the hallway. Into the shaft. Moving through the building the way water moves, finding every opening, every path that existed. Filtering through the building like water through sand, I thought. Somewhere in the part of me still composing sentences, which was either a great metaphor or literal fact. Probably both. I had one clear thought during the whole thing. Find the exit. 4 years of walking the same hallways. I knew every turn. North wing, south wing, the long corridor to the vehicle bay. The emergency exit at the east end of the building, propped open every single day with a red fire extinguisher because the keypad had been broken for 3 years and no one had ever fixed it. Thank you, underfunded and clearly underpaid maintenance department. Genuinely, from every single grain of my whole sandy heart. I found the door, pressed through the gap, and then the Nevada sun hit me and something happened that I did not expect, had no framework for, and was completely unprepared for. The sand that was me expanded, like a breath held too long finally released. The grains spread out and caught the open air, and for one moment I was enormous. A 50-foot pillar of swirling golden sand standing in the middle of the Nevada desert, and I was, despite everything, despite all of it, completely and overwhelmingly okay. Better than okay. I was free. For the first time in 4 years, I was outside with no walls around me, and no cameras watching, and no compound numbers waiting in a needle. Then a helicopter came over the roof of the facility with a spotlight, and a voice through a megaphone announced, "Subject 441B, this is your final warning to stand down immediately." Free for approximately 11 seconds, that was my new personal record for freedom in the Nevada desert. Then I ran. Not ran exactly. Moved. The sand moved. I was the sand, and the sand covered desert ground at a speed that didn't make physical sense for something without legs. Behind me, the helicopter. Vehicle vibrations on the road to the west. 3 sets of footprints moving in search patterns south of the facility, which I could feel through the ground like reading a sentence. They were slow. I was not slow. I had not been slow since the moment I passed through that door and the open desert air hit me for the first time. I moved for 3 hours without stopping. when I finally let myself settle, pooling in the shadow of a sandstone ridge in the middle of absolute nowhere. My phone said 6:14 p.m. I sat there in the cooling shadow, a pile of golden sand with a phone in the middle of it, screen facing up, 31% battery, no signal bars. Extremely relatable situation. I tried to think clearly, and here is what I learned about thinking when you're approximately 80% sand. It works fine, but the sand has opinions. My thoughts were still mine, sharp, maybe sharper, but the sand was interested in things. It wanted to feel the wind. It wanted to map what was underground. It had its own agenda. The human part of me wanted to process the fact that I had dissolved, escaped a government facility, and was now sitting in the Nevada desert with $43 and no plan. The sand part of me wanted to investigate a geological formation about 300 meters to the east and had very strong feelings about this. We negotiated. I stayed put, but I let the sand extend slightly outward, feeling the area, mapping it the way you'd run your hand along a wall in the dark to get your bearings. No humans within a kilometer. One small lizard on a flat rock to my left, completely unbothered by my existence. Wind from the northwest at around 15 miles per hour. Temperature starting to drop. I was alone. Completely, genuinely, no cameras, no monitoring equipment, alone, for the first time in 4 years. I stayed with that feeling for a while. Then I tried the thing I'd been building up to since I stopped running. So sitting in the shadow of that ridge with a lizard watching me, I tried the thing I had been avoiding. I tried to put myself back together. It was like trying to explain to yourself how to walk. You know how to do it. You've done it your entire life. But the moment you try to consciously describe the process, every step becomes a question. I knew what I looked like. 5'11", dark hair that needed a cut, the scar on my chin from a bicycle accident at age 9, the callus on my right palm from the pull-up bar in the facility gym. I focused on those details. I reached in whatever direction reaching meant now, for all the scattered particles of myself, and I pulled. Nothing happened for 30 seconds. Then something did. Slow, like remembering a word you've known your whole life that has suddenly gone temporarily blank. And then, slowly, like remembering the words to a song you used to know, the sand started moving inward, pulling together, finding home. A foot formed first, then a leg. The process was disturbing enough that I made a deliberate decision to stop thinking about it mechanically and just focus on the end result. Knee, hip, torso, 2 shoulders, 1 arm, then the other. My neck, my face, which was the strangest part, feeling your own face come back like a sculpture finishing itself. It took 40 minutes, but by 6:54 p.m., I was standing in the Nevada desert on 2 human feet, looking like a person, feeling approximately like a person, with all the standard number of limbs. I looked at my hands, flexed the fingers one at a time. They looked like my hands, felt like my hands. I picked up a rock and threw it, and it bounced off a boulder with a perfectly ordinary sound. Then I sat back down on the desert floor, put my completely reconstituted face in my completely reconstituted hands, and cried, for a while. Without being embarrassed about it, the lizard on the rock watched me cry with the flat, ancient, judgment-free eyes of a creature that has been sitting on rocks in the desert since before my problems existed. I turned into sand today, I told it. The lizard blinked once, slowly. Just needed to say that to something, I said. The lizard offered no follow-up. I wiped my face on the back of my very real, very reconstituted hand. Looked out at the desert going red and gold as the sun dropped. Made a list. Problems, in order of immediate urgency. 1. Black Ridge would be looking for me with significant resources and a strong motivation to find me before I talk to anyone. 2. No food, no water, no gear, no shelter lined up. 3. $43 cash and a phone at 31% with no signal. 4. I was a sand monster of unclear stability and unknown limitations. 5. I had absolutely no idea what the limits of this were, whether it was permanent, what not supposed to happen yet meant, or how many more stages Dr. Solis's careful timeline involved. I stared at the list for a while, sitting cross-legged in the cooling Nevada sand. Then added, Item 6. The lizard has been judging me this entire time. I pulled out my phone. First thing I did, turn off location services. Second thing, search symptoms of full-body cellular deconstruction. 0 results, predictably. Third, search turning into sand. Got a mythology article about sand djinns, a Wikipedia disambiguation page, and an enthusiastic Reddit thread about a comic book character I will not be thinking about. I put the phone away. Desert nights get cold fast, the kind of cold that catches people who've only ever experienced desert in the daytime completely off guard. I experimented. I let one hand dissolve, just one, deliberately, like turning a dial rather than a switch going off. The particles lifted in a loose cloud where my wrist ended. I held it there for a count of 10, then pulled it back. 40 seconds total, much faster than the first time I'd managed to reconstitute anything. I tried again. 30 seconds, then 20, 15. By the 9th attempt, I was under 5. Dissolve and return. Dissolve and return. Like a muscle that had always been there, just never used. The pain didn't disappear, but it became manageable. Background noise instead of the main event. And each time felt more like a choice, and less like something happening to me. This, I thought, is either the most useful ability in human history or the most disturbing personal development since the invention of the mirror. The answer was probably both, and always both. I stood up, brushed actual sand off my actual jeans, which felt like a joke the universe had written specifically for me. Started walking. No particular direction, just movement. The desert was the kind of quiet that makes you realize how loud everything else always is. No hum of machines, no ventilation, no footsteps in hallways, just wind and distance. I walked until Black Ridge was a small, pale smear of light behind me, and the stars were fully out, and I was thinking about Dr. Solis, her tablet, her careful handwriting, her professionally blank face. She knew what I was. She knew what 400-1 was designed to do. She knew what not supposed to happen yet meant, which meant she had a map of what came next, a timeline, stages I hadn't reached yet. What happened today was the beginning of something, not the end, not the accident, the beginning, the planned beginning, just slightly ahead of schedule. I stopped walking, pressed my bare foot flat against the desert floor, and felt it, really felt it, the way I'd been feeling things since the moment I came apart in Lab 7. The sand, every grain of it, the entire floor of the desert extending outward further than any human sense should reach, feeding me information like a second nervous system spread across miles of landscape. Underground water, deep and cold. Rock formations in layers like pages of a book. The long bones of something enormous that had died here before there were humans to name the desert. A road about 2 miles east. Asphalt still warm from the day, vibrating with the distant approach of a vehicle moving at highway speed. 3 people, on foot, moving south of the facility. Not random movement, coordinated. Search pattern, looking for something specific, looking for me. I pulled my foot back and went north, fast, the kind of fast that only works when you stop being entirely solid. Not fully dissolved, just loosened, less dense. The wind caught me and helped move me along. 2 miles in under 4 minutes. I stopped on a ridge and looked back at Black Ridge from above and thought about everything. 4 years. Every number-named compound. Every Friday dessert. Every conversation that ended with think of what this means for humanity. Kai. Project Sandstorm. I'd heard that name twice in 4 years. Always at the edge of rooms I wasn't supposed to be near. Always cut off when someone noticed I was listening. Project Sandstorm. And now I was, literally and physically, a sandstorm. Which meant I wasn't a subject. I was the project. I was the goal. I was what 4 years of careful groundwork had been building toward. Every test, every compound with a number instead of a name, every Friday dessert, all of it pointing here, to this ridge, to this version of me standing in the Nevada dark, made of sand and questions. I lay back on the rock, stars above, cold air, the distant sound of a helicopter I could feel before I could hear. I made a decision, not a plan. I didn't have enough information for a plan, just a decision. I was going to find out everything. What's in me? Why? What comes next? Who knows? And then I was going to decide what to do with all of it, in whatever order made the most sense once I knew what I was dealing with. But first, I checked my pocket. $43. Phone at 22% now. Dying faster than expected in the cold. And I was hungry. Genuinely, stomach audibly, haven't eaten since breakfast hungry, which I found oddly comforting. Sand monsters, apparently, still need dinner. The wind picked up from the west, warm and dry and full of desert grit, the kind of wind that feels personal in a desert at night. My skin didn't react the way skin normally reacts to wind. It prickled, yes, but pleasantly, like recognition, like something inside me turning toward the sound of its name. I closed my eyes, and for the first time since 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in Lab 7, I let go completely. Not the panicked dissolution of the lab, not the desperate run through the building. Deliberate, chosen. I let Kai, the scared kid, the one who signed for a number with zeros, the guy who just wanted his tacos, dissolve into the desert air like he'd never been more than borrowed. And the thing underneath, bigger, stranger, not yet named, not yet known, spread across the ridge in every direction like the first movement of a storm that has decided it is done staying small. It felt the desert, all of it, miles of it, the life underground and the life on the surface and the roads and the people and the ancient geology and the cold stars above and the warm rock below. And it was, despite everything, despite all of it, despite the tacos and the 4 years and the needle and the canisters, completely and undeniably and ferociously alive. I came back together slowly, sat up on the ridge, looked east where the road was, where the town would be eventually, where food and answers and the next part of this story were waiting. I stood up slowly, checking that all the pieces of me were where they were supposed to be. One foot on the ground, then the other, forward motion in the traditional human direction. The lizard was still on its rock when I came back down the ridge. It tracked me with one ancient eye as I passed. It tracked me with one ancient, flat, completely unbothered eye as I passed. Still judging me? I asked it. The lizard blinked once. Fair enough, I said, and kept walking south. If you woke up tomorrow and could turn into sand, what's the first thing you'd actually do with it? Drop it in the comments. I found a gas station at around 9 p.m. A single flickering light over a single pump in the middle of absolutely nothing. Nevada. The kind of place that exists specifically for people who made a wrong turn 2 hours ago and are now quietly reconsidering their life choices. I stood at the edge of the parking lot for a full minute, just looking at it. A building. Electric light. A person visible through the window behind the counter. Normal things. Incredibly, almost offensively normal things, given that my Tuesday had involved dissolving into sand particles and escaping a secret facility. I checked myself before walking in. 2 arms, 2 legs, 1 head, no visible sand escaping from anywhere. Passed the basic inspection. The man behind the counter looked up when the door opened, looked at me for a second, looked back down at his phone. Perfect. I was boring. I was a person who had walked in from the dark, which was normal. I bought water, 2 bottles, a gas station sandwich I would normally consider a last resort but which currently looked extraordinary, a bag of chips, a chocolate bar, $31 and change, $12 left in my pocket. I paid in cash, didn't make eye contact, and left as quickly as a person could without looking like they were leaving quickly. The man didn't ask questions, I didn't offer answers. This was the ideal human interaction for the situation I was in. I sat outside on the curb in the dark and ate the sandwich in about 45 seconds, drank half a bottle of water without stopping. Felt like a person again. Mostly. My phone had found a weak signal somewhere between the ridge and the gas station. 3% battery left. I needed to be smart. I opened my contacts. Scrolled past everyone I couldn't call right now. Mom, old friends, anyone who could be monitored, anyone whose phone might be flagged the moment my number appeared. Stopped at one name. Marcus. My cousin, 2 years older, who lived in a converted van and moved locations every few weeks on principle. He had exactly 3 opinions about government surveillance programs, all of them extreme, and all of them were apparently completely correct. Marcus was the person you called when you needed someone who owned a signal jammer and didn't consider that unusual. I called. 3 rings. Then his voice came through, cautious and careful, the voice of someone who always answers unknown numbers carefully. Unknown number. Who is this? It's Kai. I need you to not say my name out loud right now, and not ask where I'm calling from. Just listen for a second. A pause. Okay, Marcus said, very carefully, already adjusting. This is what I liked about Marcus. He didn't require a lot of explanation before taking something seriously. I need a meeting point, somewhere you've never mentioned to anyone, ever. Somewhere with no cameras, no foot traffic, nothing. Can you do that? Another pause. Longer. Highway 93, mile marker 71. There's a dirt road going east. No sign, just 2 rocks stacked on the right side. Follow it about a mile. Old water tower, tomorrow night, 10 p.m. I'll be there, I said. And Marcus, I need you to bring some things. Clothes, cash, a prepaid phone, and maybe some food that isn't from a gas station. That is a significant number of asks, Marcus said, from someone who won't tell me a single thing about what's actually happening right now. I know. I'm sorry. I'll explain everything when I see you in person. Every single detail. Fair warning, though. It's going to sound completely insane. Kai, Marcus said, and something in his voice shifted, dropped down to the register he used when he was actually worried and not performing worry. Are you safe right now? I thought about that. I was sitting outside a gas station in the Nevada desert with $12 and an unknown quantity of sand inside my body and 3 Black Ridge search teams in the general area. I'm okay, I said, which was partially true in the ways that mattered. I'll be at the water tower tomorrow night at 10. Don't be late. I hung up. Battery dropped to 1% the moment the call ended, like it had been holding on specifically for that conversation. I turned it off completely and put it back in my pocket. Then I sat on the concrete curb outside the gas station in the Nevada dark, finished my chips one by one, and thought through what came next as carefully as I could. Tomorrow was 12 hours away. In the meantime, I needed to be somewhere that wasn't on a road, wasn't near the facility, and wasn't visible from above. The desert, it turned out, was very good for not being visible from above, which was the exact property I needed right now. Particularly when the thing that needed to not be visible could spread itself thin enough across the ground to become indistinguishable from the ground itself. I experimented with this, walked about a quarter mile off the road, found a flat stretch of ground between 2 low rock formations, and then I dissolved, slowly, deliberately, the way I'd been practicing on my hand back on the ridge, controlled, intentional, like setting something down rather than dropping it. It took about 6 minutes to fully let go, but when I did, when I was completely dispersed across that patch of desert floor, something happened that I hadn't expected. I stopped being scared, not numb, not dissociated, actually genuinely not scared, like the fear was a thing that belonged to a shape I no longer had. I could still think. My thoughts were clear, clearer maybe than they'd been since the lab, without the distraction of a body reporting discomfort and cold and hunger. I could feel the desert around me in all directions, the rocks, the ground, the roots of scrubby desert plants reaching down into cool soil, the road far enough away to be a faint hum. No Black Ridge teams within range of what I could feel. They'd moved further south, toward the highway, looking for a person on foot, not for a patch of unremarkable desert ground. I settled in, and for the first time in 4 years, with no monitors and no cameras and no footsteps in hallways outside my room, I slept, sort of. Whatever the equivalent of sleep was for something that no longer had a body in the traditional sense, a stillness, a dimming, a rest. It was enough, more than enough, actually. The kind of rest I hadn't managed in 4 years of monitored sleep in a facility bed, measured and logged and probably analyzed. I woke up with the sun, or became aware of the sun, which is a more accurate description, feeling warmth across millions of surfaces simultaneously, the light registering differently than it did through eyes. Warmer, richer, like the difference between reading a description of sunlight and actually standing in it, fuller, more detailed, more present than anything I'd experienced through ordinary skin. I came back together before I was fully thinking clearly. Muscle memory, maybe, or whatever the equivalent was. The shape reassembled itself in about 4 minutes, faster than the night before. Good. Progress was measurable, and the direction was right. I was getting better at this faster than I would have expected, which probably said something about what the compound had done to my learning capacity. I sat up. Desert morning. Pale sky, long shadows, cold air that would become hot air in 2 hours. A jackrabbit about 50 meters away that had not noticed me yet. I had $12, no phone charge, and approximately 11 hours until I needed to be at mile marker 71 on Highway 93. I spent the morning doing the only productive thing available to me in the middle of the Nevada desert with $11. I practiced, systematically, like studying for a test I hadn't known was coming. Not dissolving and reconstituting. I'd done that enough to feel reasonably confident. What I hadn't tested was control, precision, whether I could move specific parts of myself independently. First experiment, I let my right hand dissolve while keeping everything else solid, clean, easy. The hand floated beside me as a loose cloud of particles while the rest of me stayed put. Second, I tried to move the hand cloud away from my body, push it out, extend it, direct it like pointing a finger. This was harder. The particles wanted to stay close. There was something like gravity pulling them toward the main body, keeping them in relationship. Not physical gravity. Some built-in cohesion from whatever the compound had done to my cells, holding the pieces in relationship even when I was actively trying to pull them apart. But with effort, real, focused effort, like learning a new physical skill, I got the hand cloud to move about 2 feet away from my body and stay there. 2 feet of separation from my own body. Not impressive by any metric I could think of, but it was movement, it was control, and more importantly, it was a direction to push in. Third experiment. I dissolved everything except my head. Just my head, sitting on the desert ground, the rest of me floating in a loose column around it. This was deeply strange to experience. I want to be honest about that. There are some experiments you run, and partway through you think, this was a mistake, and you reassemble quickly. I reassembled quickly, pulling everything back to where it belonged, and made a note to never do the head-only experiment again without a very specific reason. The fourth experiment was the one that turned out to be actually useful. I tried something in between, not full dissolution, not fully solid, moving while partially dispersed, edges loose, surfaces soft, not full sand movement the way I'd done during the escape. Something in between, mostly solid, but loosened at the edges, the surface of me slightly dispersed, like running with the windows open. I stood up from the rock where I'd been sitting and took a step. Then another. Then broke into a run, feeling the difference immediately in the way the ground felt under feet that were only mostly feet. The difference was immediate. 20% faster, roughly. The loosened edges catching air the way sails catch wind. And the ground felt different under feet that were only mostly feet. More information coming through. More contact. Like upgrading from gloves to bare hands. I ran 200 meters before stopping, pulling myself back to full solidity, and standing in the desert, breathing hard in the way that felt like habit more than necessity. 20% faster than a regular run without fully dissolving, while still maintaining coherent thought. That was genuinely, significantly, practically useful information. I spent the rest of the morning mapping the outer limits of what was possible. The big question, how much could I dissolve before I started losing coherent thought? The answer turned out to be around 80%. Past that point, thinking went loose and non-linear. Thoughts connecting sideways instead of sequentially, more like dreaming than reasoning. How far could I extend? I tested this carefully, letting particles drift away from the main mass at increasing distances. 20 feet, then 30. At 40 feet, something started pulling them back hard, not painful, but insistent, like a rubber band reaching its limit. I let them return. 40 feet. That was my current radius. Everything inside that radius I could feel and control. Everything outside it was just the world again. I also discovered something I hadn't planned to discover. sitting very still on a flat rock, eyes closed, fully concentrated on the feeling of the desert around me. Underground, about 30 meters to my east, something registered differently than rock and sand. It took me a moment to understand what I was feeling. Then I understood. I had found water. Not saw water, found it. Felt it the same way I felt the sand and rock, as information, pressure, presence. A small underground seep about 30 meters to my east, maybe 12 feet down. I walked to the spot, dug with my hands, regular hands, no sand tricks, just digging, for about 20 minutes until the soil went dark and damp. I didn't reach the water. 12 feet was too deep for bare-handed digging, but the fact that I'd found it was interesting. I could sense water underground. I could sense geological formations. I could feel pressure changes in the air. It was occurring to me gradually, not all at once, but in accumulating pieces, that I was something significantly more complex than a person who could turn into sand and back again. The sand was the obvious part, the flashy part, the wall exploding, helicopter escaping, 50-foot pillar part. But underneath the obvious sand transformation, something quieter had also been happening. My senses weren't just different, they'd been rebuilt from the ground up, expanded, layered. I wasn't just feeling the desert anymore, I was reading it, the way you read a familiar room in the dark, knowing without looking where everything sits. Dr. Solis had known all of this was coming. The sensory expansion, the geological awareness, the water finding, all of it was in her projected timeline in the notes she'd been taking on her tablet in Lab 7. The real question, the one I kept circling back to, was what else was in that timeline? What came after the sand? What came after the expanded senses? What did stage 3 look like, or stage 4? I sat with that question for a while, watching the jackrabbit from earlier make its cautious way across the flat ground, completely unaware of me. Then something else occurred to me. Something that I should have thought of immediately, but had been too overwhelmed to reach. A thought surfaced I should have reached hours earlier. I wasn't the first. This process was too calibrated, too many variables accounted for, to be anyone's genuine first attempt. Dr. Solis ran Project Sandstorm. Projects have timelines, timelines have earlier entries, and I was Subject 441B. Subject 441B. The B was the part I'd been not thinking about since the lab, because what it implied was something I needed a quiet moment to actually sit with. B means there was an A first, not the beginning. The revision, built after A, after something went wrong or went differently than planned with the first version, producing results that needed to be corrected before trying again. Which meant somewhere out there, or somewhere in the records of Blackridge Research Facility, there was a Subject 441A. Who had that been? What had happened to them? Had it worked? Had it not worked? Was not supposed to happen yet referring to the schedule, or was it referring to a comparison with what had happened to A? The jackrabbit I'd been watching all the morning finally noticed me sitting there, froze for one full second, then bolted in the direction that was not me. Good instincts. Honestly, same. I had a very long list of questions, $11 in cash, most of a water bottle, and approximately 8 hours to wait before Marcus would be at the water tower. I started walking. Toward the highway. Not on it. Parallel to it, through the scrub and rock, keeping the asphalt in sight but staying off it. Low profile. Easy. About 3 miles from mile marker 71, moving parallel to the highway through the scrub desert, I felt something change in the ground beneath me. A pattern. 2 sets of feet moving carefully. Not heard, felt. Through the ground. The pattern of feet that wasn't random. 2 sets, moving carefully, stopping, checking, moving again. Trained searchers moving in a coordinated pattern, stopping at intervals, checking in directions, doing a professional ground sweep through the desert parallel to Highway 93, looking for exactly me. I stopped moving, stood completely still for 3 full seconds while I made the decision. Then, very slowly and very deliberately, I let myself dissolve into the ground beneath my feet. Not panicked, not the explosive exit from Lab 7. Slow, controlled, deliberate, sand settling into sand, the thing that was me becoming indistinguishable from the Nevada desert floor. I stayed like that for 20 minutes, feeling the two sets of footsteps move through the area around me, come within 60 feet, pause, move on. Both sets of footsteps moved through my position, passed within 60 feet, and continued south without pausing once. They walked through the desert that was me, and found nothing but desert. I stayed dissolved for another 10 minutes after I couldn't feel them anymore. Then I came back together and sat very still and thought about what just happened. 2 trained operatives had walked within 60 feet of me and found nothing. Not because I'd hidden behind something, because I had become the thing they were walking on. I was the desert. The desert was me. And even trained searchers couldn't find something that wasn't distinguishable from the ground they were standing on. I stayed dispersed for 10 more minutes after I couldn't feel them anymore, just to be sure. Then I came back together and sat quietly in the desert and understood something new about what I was. It also told me Black Ridge was serious. 2 trained ground teams in addition to the helicopter. They wanted me back badly enough to sweep the desert on foot. That level of resource told me I was important. Not flatteringly important. The kind of important that means you cannot leave because too much has been built around the assumption that you stay. Project Sandstorm had spent 4 years building me into whatever I was now. That was significant investment in time, money, and classified resources. The idea of that investment walking away into the Nevada desert on $43 and a bad attitude was simply not going to be acceptable to the people running the project. I understood that completely. I understood the logic. From Black Ridge's perspective, losing me was losing the project. I didn't blame them for trying. I just had no intention of being found, which made their perspective somewhat irrelevant. I kept moving toward mile marker 71, more carefully now, staying dissolved at the edges, reading the ground constantly. The sun was getting serious by mid-afternoon, the kind of Nevada heat that feels like standing inside something, not outside it. I noticed something interesting. I wasn't hot, not in the way I should have been. The heat registered. I felt it. I was aware of it. But it wasn't uncomfortable the way it would have been a day ago. The desert was my element now, literally. The hot, dry air and the sun-baked sand were things I was made of, not things that were happening to me. I lay flat on a pale stretch of rock and let the afternoon sun hit me directly. Full surface exposure. Nothing blocking it. The warmth moved through me differently than through skin. Deeper, more distributed. Something responded to it the same way it had on the ridge the night before, but amplified now in the full desert afternoon. Like a battery being charged by something other than electricity. Like the sun was a fuel source available to whatever I was now. One I didn't understand yet, but could feel the edges of clearly. I filed it carefully in the part of my mind running the ongoing inventory of things I didn't yet understand, but needed to. The list was getting long. The sun thing went near the top. By the time the sun started dropping, I was within half a mile of the mile marker, tucked into the shadow of a rock formation, waiting. I had 6 hours. I used them carefully. Slept again, dissolved and dispersed and resting, keeping enough awareness to monitor the ground around me for footsteps. Nothing came through the ground. No footsteps, no vehicles close enough to register, no organized movement in any direction I could feel. The search teams had shifted their focus elsewhere for now. At 9:45 p.m., I felt it. A vehicle coming from the south on 93, slowing down near mile marker 71, turning onto the dirt road. I came back together slowly, checking each part as it returned, making sure everything was where it was supposed to be. Then I stood up and started walking toward the water tower. The water tower appeared as a dark shape against the star field. At around the same moment, I heard a van engine cut off nearby. Old, rusted, leaning about 5 degrees off vertical. The kind of structure that had stopped being useful long before I was born and had been slowly becoming part of the landscape ever since. Marcus was already outside the van when I arrived, standing in the dark with his flashlight off, which was the right call. No light signal to anyone watching from distance. He was waiting the specific way someone waits when they've thought through the possibility that whoever they're meeting might have company they don't know about. I walked toward the van until I was close enough to be a visible shape in the dark, then stopped and stood still so he could see me before I got any closer. "It's me," I said. "Don't shoot." Marcus clicked his flashlight on for exactly 1 second, just long enough to confirm what he was looking at, then off again. "You look," he said carefully, "like you slept in the desert." "I did sleep in the desert," I said, "sort of. It's a longer explanation than it sounds like. Is there food in that bag? I've been running on 1 gas station sandwich since last night." "Sort of," he repeated. He handed me a backpack. "Clothes, 200 in cash, burner phone, charged, protein bars and a real sandwich. What's happening?" I sat down on the ground. Marcus sat across from me. The stars above Nevada were doing their full excessive display. No light pollution for miles. "I need you to listen to the whole thing before you say anything," I said. "Not react at the 5-sentence mark, not interrupt. The whole thing, start to finish, and then you can respond." "Okay," Marcus said, which from him meant more than it sounds. It meant he'd actually set aside whatever he was already thinking and was creating genuine space to hear something new. "I mean it. The whole thing. There's a part about 1/3 of the way through that's going to test your instinct to cut me off and say that's impossible. I need you to let that part pass." "Kai," Marcus said, "I live in a van specifically so that no entity, public or private, can reliably locate me at any given moment. I am the correct person for whatever this is. Tell me." So I told him. Everything. Starting from the contract 4 years ago, going through every compound and every numbered injection, the Tuesday in Lab 7, the needle at 2:47 p.m., and then I showed him. Because there's a version of this conversation that ends with your cousin thinking you've had some kind of breakdown, and I needed to skip past that version. I held out my right hand, and I let it dissolve. Slow and controlled, the particles lifting and spreading in the beam of Marcus's flashlight, catching the light like a tiny private sandstorm. Marcus didn't move, didn't speak. Watched my hand come apart particle by particle in the beam of his flashlight. Then I brought it back. Fingers, palm, the callus on my thumb. All of it returning to the shape it recognized as home. The silence, after I finished, lasted long enough that I started counting seconds. Then Marcus said, very quietly and with great precision, "So when they said vitamins, that was a lie." "Yes," I said. "The vitamin thing was, in fact, a complete lie from the very beginning. Apologies for not figuring that out sooner, though I'd like to point out I was 19 and broke." Another silence. Then he reached into the bag he'd brought and produced a second sandwich, set it in front of me. "Eat," he said, "then we make a plan." I ate the sandwich in about a minute flat, while Marcus sat across from me on the ground, thinking through whatever he was thinking through, the Nevada stars doing their full indifferent display overhead. When I finished eating, Marcus looked at me with the specific expression he used when he was already 6 steps ahead and waiting for you to catch up. "Okay," he said. "What do you actually need?" "Information," I said. "I need to know what Project Sandstorm is, what its full scope is, whether there are other subjects, what stage they think I'm in, and what comes after." "And where," Marcus said, pulling a small notebook from his jacket pocket in a way that suggested he'd been waiting for the strategic part of this conversation. "Does that information currently live?" I looked at him. "Inside Blackridge Research Facility, in the files of Dr. Raina Solis, head of Project Sandstorm, which is in the Nevada desert approximately 22 miles northeast of where we're sitting." Marcus nodded slowly. "So what you're saying is, the plan is to break back into the facility you just escaped from?" "Not break in," I said, because the distinction felt important. "Infiltrate. Enter without detection, access specific files, exit without leaving evidence. There is a meaningful operational difference." "I'm curious," Marcus said, without any inflection that told me whether he was being serious or not. "Walk me through the practical difference between those two things as you're defining them." "Mostly," I said, "that breaking in sounds like something you do when you're panicking and infiltrating sounds like something you do when you've had time to think, which I have." "Somewhat. 8 hours of it." Marcus looked at me for a long moment in the dark, then reached into his jacket and produced, because this was Marcus, and of course, he had one, a folded topographic map of exactly this part of Nevada. He spread it on the ground between us and clicked his flashlight on at its lowest setting, just enough to see the contour lines. Marcus spread the topographic map flat on the ground between us and clicked his flashlight on it low, angling it so it only lit the map. "Show me exactly where the facility sits on this," he said. I pointed. Marcus studied the map. I ate the second sandwich. Above us, the stars provided no opinions, but excellent visibility. "Okay," Marcus said finally. "Here's my question. You can turn into sand. You're standing 22 miles from the building. What exactly do you need me for?" I considered this. "Moral support," I said. "And the map. And the sandwiches." The sandwiches were really important. Marcus studied the map without speaking for what felt like 3 full minutes. Then he folded it, put it back in his jacket, stood up, and looked at me with the expression that meant a decision had been made. "I'm going to drive to this location," Marcus said, pointing at a spot on the map about a mile from the outer fence. "I park there. I wait. 4 hours maximum. If you're not back in 4 hours, I call this number." He wrote something on a scrap of paper and passed it over. "Her name is Dana. She's good and she asks very few questions. Those 2 things are related." "Marcus," I said, reading the scrap of paper, "is this a lawyer you keep specifically for situations involving classified facility infiltration? Because that is a very specific thing to have ready." "I live in a van by choice," Marcus said with genuine dignity. "I plan for things." He picked up his bag. 4 hours, Kai. If you're not back, I call Dana, and then I assume whatever I need to assume." He walked back to the van. I looked at the topographic map he'd left me, at the star field above Nevada, at my hand, which was perfectly normal in every visible way. Then I let the edges go soft, felt the desert around me wake up in every direction, feeding me its geography, its distances, its contours. 22 miles, in the open desert, moving the way I moved now, loosened, light, wind-assisted. That was about 40 minutes. I turned north and started moving. The van's headlights swept the dirt road, going south as Marcus drove away, and I watched them go for exactly 1 second before I picked up speed and headed for Blackridge. The night air hit me, and I moved with it rather than through it, the desert floor reading itself to me as I crossed, every dip and rise and dry creek bed feeding me information. 22 miles of Nevada laid out like a map I was tracing with my entire body, every geological feature legible, the whole landscape a text I was learning to read at speed. Blackridge Research Facility appeared as a light cluster on the horizon at around the 40-minute mark. Then, closer, as a fence. Cameras, guards. I stopped about 200 meters from the outer perimeter fence, crouched low in the desert scrub, and did something that didn't use my eyes or my ears. I felt, extended outward, read the facility. There was a gap in the northwest camera coverage. 14 seconds between rotation cycles. I could feel the timing in the electronic vibration of the camera mechanisms through the fence posts. I'd walked past that camera every day for 4 years without ever noticing the gap, because I'd never needed to notice it before. Need changes what you pay attention to. I had never needed the gap before. Now I needed it very specifically, and the fact that I knew exactly where it was and exactly how long it lasted felt like the desert handing me something useful. 14 seconds was enough. For something that didn't need to fit through a gap in a fence so much as filter through it, 14 seconds was more than enough time to be somewhere else entirely. I sat in the dark outside the fence and thought about Dr. Solis, about her files, about what I was about to find out. Then I let go, and the desert floor gained one more patch of sand that wasn't quite sand, patient and very still, and waiting for the camera to rotate. The camera rotated away at 11:47 p.m., and I went through the fence like fog through a screen door, which is a sentence I never expected to think about myself. Not dramatically, not with a tense countdown. I let the edges of myself go soft and move through the gap in the wire mesh like I belonged there. Technically, I had spent 4 years in that facility earning some kind of right to its air. This felt like collecting on it. I was inside Blackridge in under 3 seconds. On the other side of the fence, I pulled myself back together and crouched in the shadow of the outer maintenance building, listening. 2 guards on the north perimeter. One moving east, one stationary near the vehicle bay. Neither looking in my direction. I could feel them through the ground. Footsteps have weight and pattern, and I was learning to read both the way you learn to read handwriting, imperfectly at first, then faster. The facility at night was a different animal than the facility during the day. Quieter, fewer people. The research wing's mostly dark, the administrative section lit but empty-looking through the windows. Lab 7 was in the central research wing. Dr. Solis's office was one floor above it. I'd passed her office door hundreds of times in 4 years and never once been invited inside. I had passed that door hundreds of times in 4 years and never been on the other side of it. Tonight, I was going to let myself in, whether it wanted me or not. The maintenance building had a ventilation access panel on its south face. I knew because I'd helped a facilities tech replace a filter there 14 months ago. He'd left the panel screws slightly loose because he was in a hurry and never came back to finish the job. Detail by detail, I had been building an accidental map of this place for 4 years. Detail by detail, I had spent 4 years building an accidental map of every shortcut in this facility. I just hadn't known I was making it. I moved along the maintenance building's shadow, slow and low, and reached the panel. 4 screws, the bottom left one almost hand loose. I worked it open in under a minute and slipped inside. The ventilation shafts of Blackridge were not designed to accommodate a person. They were designed to move air, which they did efficiently, and the air inside was cold and smelled like recycled climate control. They were, however, exactly the right size for something that didn't need to maintain a consistent physical shape the entire time, a category I now occupied. They were, however, exactly the right size for something that didn't need to maintain a consistent shape the whole time, which, as of yesterday, was a category I now fit into. I dissolved to about 60% and moved through the shaft system the way I'd moved through it during the escape, flowing rather than crawling, following the geometry of the ductwork without needing to fit inside it, going where the air went, which turned out to be exactly where I needed to go. 4 years of walking the same corridors had given me a map I hadn't known I was making. Left at the first junction, right at the second, up the vertical shaft past the first floor, left again toward the central research corridor. Every turn arriving correctly, every branch recognizable, the whole facility laid out in memory, like a blueprint I'd absorbed without trying. I came out through a ceiling vent into the second floor hallway and reconstituted in the shadow between 2 wall-mounted emergency lights. I held still in the vent opening for a full 30 seconds, reading the corridor through the floor and walls before I let myself drop. No footsteps. No one in the hallway. Dr. Solis's office was 7 doors down on the right, number 217. I knew the number from 4 years of walking past it. I had never been inside. The door was always closed in the specific way that communicates stay out rather than simply closed for now. A quality some doors have that's hard to articulate but impossible to miss. I moved to door 217 and tried the handle the way you try a handle you already know is locked, just to confirm you're not getting lucky tonight. I was not getting lucky tonight. Locked. Obviously locked. I hadn't actually expected otherwise, but there's always a part of you that hopes the universe is going to make it easy just this once. The lock was a standard keycard system, the same model on every interior door in Blackridge. I'd watched the facilities tech replace 3 of them over 4 years without meaning to learn anything. The keycard reader had a small gap between its casing and the wall plate, about 2 millimeters. I stood in the hallway and looked at that gap and thought, 2 millimeters might be enough. 2 millimeters was, it turned out, exactly enough space for something that didn't need to remain a solid object to operate a door mechanism from the inside. I sent a thin thread of particles through the gap, less than a finger's worth of sand, moving carefully through the interior of the reader mechanism, feeling its way toward the contact point, the way you feel along a wall in the dark for a light switch. Finding it, settling against it. The mechanism made a sound like a careful thought completing itself, and then the door opened inward, and I stood there for a second, genuinely surprised I'd just done that. I stood there for a second, genuinely surprised it had worked. Then I went inside and closed the door behind me. Dr. Solis's office was exactly what I should have expected, and somehow wasn't. Not a sterile lab space, an actual office, books on shelves, a potted plant on the windowsill, a coffee mug with a faded university logo on the desk next to the monitor. The office of a person, not a scientist. A framed photo near the monitor. Dr. Solis, younger, standing with 2 other people in white coats outside a building I didn't recognize. Smiling. She had a different face when she was smiling. More human. I looked at that photo for exactly 1 second. Dr. Solis smiling, younger, more human. And then I put it down and moved to the computer because I had a specific reason for being here. Password protected. Obviously password protected. I hadn't expected otherwise, and I was starting to see a theme in my expectations versus reality this evening. I didn't have her password. What I had was something I'd only discovered 40 minutes ago, when I felt the camera system through the fence posts and understood I was reading electrical current. I pressed my palm flat against the keyboard and sent my awareness through the keys and into the machine, following the electricity the way I'd followed water underground that morning. I pressed my palm flat against the keyboard, sent my awareness through the keys into the machine, following the electricity the way I'd followed water underground that morning. It was like reading Braille in the dark, slow, uncertain, more feeling than understanding. But after about 3 minutes of concentration so intense it gave me something like a headache, the screen unlocked. I had no idea how I'd done it. Not technically, not mechanically, not in any way I could describe. I added it to the growing inventory of things I could apparently do now. The files were organized with the logic of someone who had been keeping long-term secrets. Folders within folders, project names that sounded like weather events, subject numbers in place of names. I found the Project Sandstorm folder in under 2 minutes. It was the only one I was looking for, and I'd been thinking about nothing else for 24 hours. I found the Project Sandstorm folder in under 2 minutes because it was the only folder I was looking for, and I had been thinking about nothing else for 24 hours. I opened the Project Sandstorm folder and waited for a moment, the way you wait before opening something you've been thinking about for 24 straight hours. The first thing in the folder wasn't a report or a data file. It was a photograph, full screen, a face looking back at me from 4.5 years ago. Not of me. A young man, maybe 19 or 20, dark hair, a facility ID badge hanging around his neck, standing somewhere in an early version of Lab 7. Standing in what looked like an early version of Lab 7. Less equipment, different configuration, the same basic bones but stripped down to the essentials of whatever early stage of the project this had been. A different time, a different version of the lab, a photograph taken by someone who expected they would need the record of this specific moment later and was correct about that. Below the photo, subject 441A, name Daniel Reyes. Age at enrollment 19, enrollment date 4.5 years ago, 6 months before me. I stared at the photo of Daniel Reyes for longer than I should have, given that I was in a locked office in a classified facility at midnight. It was hard to look away. Daniel Reyes. Subject 441A. 19 years old in the photo, ID badge around his neck, standing in an early version of Lab 7 that looked barely finished. I took one more second to look at his face. Just a regular face. A person face. A face that had no idea what was coming. And then I scrolled down into the reports. The early reports read exactly like mine. Physical assessments, compound responses, progress notes in Dr. Solis's precise clinical language, the same tone she'd used on my results, the same careful precision. Applied to a different person who had sat in the same chair and signed the same kind of contract and been told the same things about vitamins, Daniel had responded to the compound series faster than projected. Stronger physical response, higher integration rate, all of it logged as excellent, the same word she'd used about me. Then, at the 8-month mark, the entries changed, the language shifted. The same clinical precision was there, but pointed at different things, describing different outcomes. The notes got shorter, the language shifted, less clinical, more careful. Words like unexpected and outside projected parameters and further monitoring required. And then a gap in the records, 3 full weeks where the file was simply empty. No notes, no assessments, no monitoring logs, no entries of any kind. 3 weeks of silence. Then one entry, dated 3.5 years ago, written in language so flat and controlled it took me a moment to understand what it was actually saying. One entry, dated 3.5 years ago, in the same flat controlled language Dr. Solis used for everything. Subject 441A, status, terminated, nothing else. I stopped reading and sat with that word for a moment. Terminated. Not discontinued, not withdrawn, not transferred. Terminated, the way you terminate a process that has stopped working. I sat with it. The weight of it. The specific, deliberate choice of that word over every other word available to describe what had happened to Daniel Reyes at the age of 20. Terminated, not withdrew from study, not transitioned, not ended treatment. Terminated, the word you use when you are being precise about the fact that something has been stopped permanently, which meant Daniel Reyes, 19 years old, from wherever he was from, who had signed a contract for a number with zeros the same as I had. Daniel Reyes was dead, and Dr. Solis, who drank coffee from a faded mug and kept a plant on her windowsill, had taken careful clinical notes throughout the entire process and filed them neatly. I kept reading, not because I wanted to. I didn't want to, not at all, but needing to know something and wanting to know it have never been the same category. The termination report was clinical and thorough in the way that the worst documents always are. Complete cellular disintegration, it said. Loss of cohesion. Subject unable to maintain stable reconstitution. In plain language, stripped of the clinical distance, Daniel had dissolved the way I'd dissolved, and then he'd been unable to reconstitute, and that had been the end of him. I looked at my hands, both of them, solid, present, every finger in its correct position. The scar on my chin from a bike accident at age 9 still exactly where it belonged. The difference between Daniel and me, according to the next 40 pages of Project Sandstorm files, was compound 441 itself. What had been administered to Daniel was version 441 alpha, an earlier formulation. What was in me was version 441 beta, refined, corrected, built on the specific information gathered from watching 4141 alpha fail. I was the version they had built after learning what killed the first one, the corrected formula, the improved attempt, built specifically from understanding what had gone wrong with Daniel. I sat in Dr. Solis's chair in the dark of her office at midnight and felt something I didn't have a clean word for. Not guilt. I hadn't done anything to Daniel Reyes. Not grief, exactly, because I hadn't known him. Something adjacent to both. The specific weight of being alive in a particular way because someone else wasn't alive anymore. Something that sat adjacent to grief and guilt without being exactly either one. The specific weight of being alive in a particular way because someone else wasn't alive anymore. I pushed past the termination report and kept reading because the file continued. Because there was significantly more after Daniel's death, and I needed to know what it said. The Project Sandstorm files didn't end with my enrollment. They extended forward into projections, timelines, stage breakdowns for what was supposed to happen after the initial transformation. Stage 1 was listed as cellular restructuring, complete. That was Tuesday in Lab 7. The dissolution, the escape, the 50-foot pillar in the Nevada sun. Stage 1, apparently, done. Stage 2, sensory expansion and environmental integration, ongoing. That was what had been happening since I hit the open desert. The geological awareness, the water finding, the heat absorption. Stage 3, active integration. The subject's matrix would begin interfacing with environmental sand at range, extending beyond the body itself, building something external. The sand around me wasn't just information I could receive. It was material I could extend into, shape from a distance, build with. I read that part 3 times before I accepted what it was actually telling me about what I was in the process of becoming. Building something external. The sand around me wasn't just information I could receive. It was becoming material I could extend into, structure I could shape from a distance. I thought about the 40-foot radius from that morning. The sand responding to me like it was already an extension of my body, rather than something separate. Stage 3 was already underway. Had been since I hit the open desert and felt the ground wake up around me in every direction. The 40-foot radius, the geological awareness, the water I'd found underground by feeling for it. All of it. Stage 3 running ahead of the protocol's schedule. Building something external. Meaning the sand around me wasn't just something I could feel and influence, it was becoming something I could build with, something I could extend into. I thought about the 40-foot radius I'd discovered that morning, the way the sand around me had started feeling like an extension of myself, not just information I was receiving. Stage 3 had already begun. The 40-foot radius I'd felt that morning, the geological awareness, the ability to feel the ground like a second skin extending away from me in all directions. Stage 4 had shorter notes, more guarded language, the same careful construction that had appeared right before Daniel's termination entry. Control, integration. The subject would need to maintain cognitive dominance over the expanding cellular network, or something would happen that the sentence didn't finish describing. If cognitive dominance was not maintained, the note said, using the same flat controlled language as the termination report, I stopped before the end of the sentence. I didn't need to finish it. The termination report for Daniel Reyes had already told me, in precise clinical language, where that road ended. Daniel had lost the thread. The dissolution had expanded past the point where he could hold it together cognitively, and when that happened, there was no coming back. That was the failure mode built into the protocol, the thing they'd tried to correct between Daniel and me, the reason 441B existed instead of just a single version of the compound. That was what not supposed to happen yet meant. The dissolution in Lab 7, the 50-foot pillar in the Nevada sun, that was stage 3 behavior, and I'd jumped directly to it. I'd arrived somewhere the protocol hadn't prepared for before the safeguards for that stage were in place. She hadn't been ready for me to get there that fast, which meant that when I arrived at stage 3 behavior in Lab 7, ahead of the timeline, the protocols Dr. Solis had planned for that stage hadn't been implemented yet. She wasn't ready. I sat in the dark of Dr. Solis's office in the middle of a classified facility and thought about what it meant to arrive somewhere before the person who built the road had finished it. Then I kept scrolling, past the stage breakdown, past the monitoring protocols, past the projected timeline, and I found a section that shifted everything I'd just understood. A section labeled External Applications, dated recently. The last entry was 3 days ago, 2 days before the injection in Lab 7. I read the External Applications section the way you read something you already suspect you're not going to like but need to understand completely anyway, carefully, all of it. The language in this section was the most direct thing I'd read in the entire file. No clinical softening, no passive constructions, just plain statements about what I would be able to do. A subject who completed all 4 stages would be capable of large-scale environmental manipulation at range, structural disruption of geological formations, electromagnetic interference at close quarters, and, the part that stopped me completely, indefinite physical dispersion across a geographic area of up to several square miles. Not a range, a coverage area, several miles of terrain simultaneously, several square miles, not a radius of 40 feet. Not a useful range of a few hundred meters, several square miles of geographic area, simultaneously, with awareness and potential control. Not a person who could turn into sand. Not an operative with an unusual ability. Something the scale of a weather event. Everywhere and nowhere across miles of terrain at once. I sat back in Dr. Solis's chair and looked at the ceiling and thought about the difference between being a person with a power and being something that had stopped being a person. I sat back in Dr. Solis's chair and looked at the ceiling of her office and thought about the difference between being a person with an unusual ability and being something else entirely. The coffee mug with the faded university logo sat on the desk next to the monitor. I looked at it for a long time. Dr. Solis had a plant on her windowsill. She smiled differently when she was younger. She drank coffee from a mug she'd kept long enough for the logo to fade. Dr. Solis had a plant on her windowsill. She kept a coffee mug with a faded logo. She smiled in old photos in a way that made her look human and present and warm. And she had spent 4 years building a weapon. Building me, not a person. A delivery system. Something that could be dispersed across miles of terrain. For applications, the External Applications section described in language that was going to take me a very long time to finish processing. I copied every folder in the Project Sandstorm directory to the USB drive from Marcus's bag. The transfer took 4 minutes. I sat in the dark and watched the progress bar move and thought about Daniel Reyes and what his voice had sounded like when it was no longer being careful about how it sounded. Marcus's level of advanced preparation was something I was going to think about carefully at a later time, when I was not inside a classified facility at midnight copying classified files. I put the office back as close to how I'd found it as I could manage in the dark. Chair position, monitor sleep state, the photo near the computer facing the same direction it had been. I put the office back the way I'd found it. Chair, monitor, photo, coffee mug. And then reached for the door handle and stopped. Something in the floor had changed. Not a sound I could point to. Not a visual cue from anywhere in the room. A feeling. Through the floor, through the walls, the same way I'd been reading surfaces since Lab 7. Not a sound. Not a sight. A feeling. Through the floor, through the walls, the way I'd been reading everything through surfaces since the moment I first dissolved. There was a shape on the other side of the door. Stationary. The weight distribution of someone standing and waiting, not walking, not patrolling, deliberately still, not moving. Standing in the specific way that people stand when they're waiting for something they know is going to happen, rather than patrolling and expecting nothing in particular. I pressed myself against the wall beside the door and reached outward through the floor, mapping the shape on the other side. One person, medium build, not a guard. The weight distribution was wrong for someone in full tactical gear. Standing directly in front of Dr. Solis's office door, about 2 feet from the handle. Patient, not knocking, not identifying themselves, just standing there on the other side of door 217 in a way that was much more unsettling than if they'd just knocked. Which meant someone knew the office was occupied, not guessed. Knew, with enough certainty, to stand and wait rather than call it in and escalate. I had 4 options, and none of them were excellent. Go through the door and deal with whoever was standing on the other side of it. Go back through the ventilation system. Go through the window, 2nd floor, 15-foot drop to the maintenance area below. Or dissolve through the solid wall, which I hadn't tested and which had a non-trivial failure mode. Or dissolve through the wall, which I hadn't tried with a solid wall before and which might work, and might also be the kind of thing that, if it failed, I'd have about half a second to regret. After about 4 seconds of evaluation, I chose the window, 2nd floor, 15-foot drop to the maintenance area below. The oldest exit strategy there is, and historically, reliable. I moved to it carefully, unlatched it, older mechanism, manual, no alarm sensor on this one, I was almost certain. Slid it up, felt the night air come in. I had the window unlatched and open 2 inches when the door handle moved, not all the way. Just a test, the careful movement of someone checking whether the lock was holding. I didn't wait to see who opened the door. I went through the window, dissolved mid-air before I reached the ground, and reformed in the shadow of the maintenance building. The window finished closing above me. The figure in the hallway, whoever they were, would find an empty office. I was already outside. I pressed into the shadow of the maintenance building and extended outward through the ground, mapping the 2nd floor hallway. The figure at door 217 was still there, still standing. Whoever was on the other side of that door had either arrived 1 second too late or had made a decision to wait rather than enter. Either way, I was outside and they were in. Either way, I had 3.5 hours of Marcus's 4-hour window left, and I was already outside the building with a USB drive full of Project Sandstorm files. I had a USB drive full of Project Sandstorm files, a clear path to the perimeter fence, and 3.5 hours of Marcus's 4-hour window remaining. I could leave. Right now, I should leave. Every logical calculation I could run said leave. Take the files, get to Marcus, get somewhere safe, process what I'd just read with distance between me and this building. Instead, I stood in the Nevada dark outside Blackridge and thought about Daniel Reyes. 19 years old when he signed, dark hair, an ID badge around his neck in the photo, a face that looked the way mine had probably looked the day I signed the contract, and was mostly thinking about the number of zeros at the end of the first payment. Daniel Reyes had made it 8 months into the protocol, and then the dissolution had expanded past what he could hold together. He hadn't gotten to stand in the open Nevada air and feel free. I was the corrected version, the formula revised after watching the first version fail. I existed because Daniel didn't. That fact had a shape I kept trying to look at directly. But somewhere inside this building, Daniel Reyes existed as more than a file number and a termination entry, more than 40 pages of clinical notes written in someone else's careful language. There had to be something else, some record of him as a person rather than a subject. I didn't know what I was looking for. Just that leaving without trying felt wrong. I didn't know what I was looking for. Just that walking away with the data and leaving Daniel Reyes as nothing but a file number felt wrong in a way I couldn't argue myself out of. I went back toward the central research wing. Not through the ventilation this time, along the exterior wall instead, dissolved thin enough to move like shadow along the building's face. The long-term storage room was on the ground floor, below grade, accessible from a door on the building's east face that I'd seen exactly once. I'd been there once, 2 years ago, pushing a facilities cart on someone else's request. The room was behind the research wing, below grade, accessed through a heavy door with a manual bolt and a keypad. The manual bolt was slightly warped. It had to be lifted before it would slide. A facilities tech had mentioned it with great irritation the one time I'd been there. The manual bolt detail had stuck in my memory for no reason except that the tech who'd shown me the room had complained about it at length. I stood in the Nevada dark outside that door and was genuinely grateful for every person I'd ever met at Black Ridge who'd complained about something specific within my hearing. I worked the door for 3 minutes, feeling the mechanism through particles threaded into the gap around the bolt housing, until the warped bolt finally lifted and slid, and the door gave inward with a sound like something that had been holding its breath for a long time, finally letting it go. Long-term storage smelled like cold and old paper, and something chemical underneath both. Metal shelving in rows, labeled boxes, archived files. Dim emergency lighting made everything the same shade of pale grey. The whole room had the feeling of something that had been waiting for a very long time and had stopped expecting anyone to come. I moved through the rows systematically. Project designations on box labels, names and codes I didn't know, projects that had come and gone before mine, parallel research streams I hadn't been told about. I found the sandstorm shelves at the back of the storage room. 4 shelves of archived boxes, labeled by date and subject designation, going back further than I'd expected. There was an entire shelf dedicated to Subject 441A. More boxes than I would have predicted for 8 months of trial. More than you'd keep for something you'd decided was terminated and finished. I pulled the closest box. Inside, physical files, printed reports, handwritten notes, photographs. Daniel at various stages of the testing protocol, medical readings, compound response charts. And at the bottom of the box, under everything else, a small voice recorder, the kind researchers used for field notes, labeled in handwriting that wasn't Dr. Solis's, a different hand, rounder, less precise. I held the recorder for a moment, a small, ordinary piece of plastic that had no business being the most important object in the room. Then I pressed play and listened, static for 2 seconds. Then a voice came through, young, male, with a particular tiredness of someone who has been trying to sound fine in official settings and is finally not doing that. Day 247. It's getting harder to hold the shape. Not during the tests. During the tests I'm fine, I focus, and it works. But at night, when I'm trying to sleep, I start to come apart at the edges. I don't think I should tell Dr. Solis about this, the voice continued, after a pause that sounded like someone deciding something. She'll put it in the report, and it'll become a thing. I don't think I should tell Dr. Solis about this. She'll put it in the report, and it'll become a thing. And right now I need it to not be a thing. A longer pause, the kind where you can feel someone reaching for something that matters and trying to figure out how to say it correctly. My name is Daniel Reyes, the recording said. I'm 20 years old. I'm from El Paso, Texas. I have a mom and a younger sister named Lucia. I'm saying this because I've been thinking about how sometimes when you're becoming something else, you need to say out loud what you were before, so it stays somewhere, so something knows. The recording ended mid-silence, like he'd thought of something else to say, and then decided against it. The small click of the stop button, and then just the sound of the storage room. I stood in the cold storage room in the dark and held a dead man's voice recorder and felt the 40-foot radius of desert floor around me extending in every direction. Alive, present, completely mine. and I thought about what Daniel had said about saying out loud what you were before it changed. My name is Kai. I'm 23 years old. I'm from a town with no traffic lights. I have a mom who worked double shifts. I'm saying this because I understand now what Daniel meant. When you're becoming something else, you need to keep saying what you were before. Otherwise, the something else might forget to keep you inside it. I put Daniel Reyes's voice recorder in my jacket pocket, closed the box carefully, and put it back exactly where I'd found it. Took nothing else from the shelf. I pulled the storage room door closed behind me and listened to the bolt settle back into its warped housing with the same exhale sound as before, and then stood in the dark hallway for a moment. Moved back through the desert dark toward the fence, the 14-second window, the open Nevada night on the other side. I was at the fence when I felt it. Not footsteps, something larger. A vibration in the ground that wasn't vehicle or person, a pattern I hadn't encountered before, coming from the east, about a mile out. Rhythmic, heavy, moving toward the facility at a pace that was deliberate without being fast. The pace of something that knew exactly where it was going and had no reason to rush. I pressed my feet against the desert ground and extended my awareness outward as far as it would reach, following the vibration back toward its source, trying to identify what I was feeling. And I couldn't, which was the first time since the dissolution that I'd felt something through the desert floor and not been able to immediately identify what it was. Whatever was out there didn't feel like a person, didn't register like a vehicle. The weight was wrong, the distribution was wrong, the pattern of movement was wrong for either category. It felt like something that had never needed to fit into either of those categories and had therefore never bothered trying. Something that moved on its own terms across the desert floor. I went back through the fence, 14-second window, camera rotation, the gap in the northwest coverage, and reformed on the other side, and stood in the open desert and looked east. Nothing visible in any direction. Dark, clear Nevada sky running its full star program. Flat terrain in every direction, pale and featureless in the ambient light. Nothing that shouldn't be there, but the vibration was still in the ground beneath me. Closer now, half a mile, maybe slightly less. And the pattern had changed in a way that made me stop breathing for a second. Less rhythmic, more careful, like something that had been moving steadily and had just noticed it was being sensed through the ground and had adjusted accordingly. It knew I was reading it, and then the pattern of movement changed. The vibration shifted, became less rhythmic, more adjusting, the movement of something that had been walking steadily and had just noticed it was being sensed. My 40-foot radius of sand was suddenly the most important thing I'd thought about all day, and 40 feet felt like not nearly enough. I stood very still in the Nevada dark with a USB drive full of files about what I was becoming, and a dead man's voice recorder in my pocket. And then the vibration stopped completely. One moment it was there, half a mile out, moving, adjusting, and then it simply wasn't. Total absence, like something stepping off a surface entirely. The Nevada desert went silent in a way that felt deliberate. No wind, no insect sounds, no distant highway hum. Just the stars and the dark and the complete absence of whatever had been moving. And then a voice from somewhere in the dark about 100 meters to my east. Low, rough. The sound of something that had learned to form words from an unusual direction. Correctly formed, recognizable as language, but carrying an accent that didn't belong to any human mouth I'd ever heard speak. Then, from about 100 meters to my east, a voice. Low and rough, like gravel finding the shape of words. Subject 441B. Not a question, not a greeting, an identification, said the way you say the name of something you've been tracking across terrain for a long time and have finally found standing exactly where you expected it to be. I took one breath, let the edges go soft, felt the desert floor extend out from me in all directions, reading everything in range. I took one breath, let the edges go soft, extended outward through the desert floor in every direction, reading everything in range, and said, very quietly, into the dark, "Who are you?" The silence stretched out long enough that I began running through explanations. An echo, a misheard sound, my own exhaustion manufacturing a voice out of Nevada wind. Then the voice came back, steady, clear, with that same accent of someone who had learned words from a direction other than human. I am what 441A became, before they wrote that I was terminated. I didn't run. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to dissolve and move and put miles between me and whatever was standing in the dark. I stayed put. That felt important. Every instinct I developed in the last 48 hours was telling me to dissolve and move and put distance between myself and whatever was standing in the dark 100 meters away. I stayed put, feet on the ground. Awareness extended outward through the desert floor in every direction, reading everything in range. Because if 441A was out there, if Daniel Reyes was out there in some form after 3.5 years of a termination report that was apparently incorrect, then running was the wrong move. You don't run from the person who survived what you're afraid of becoming. You stay and you listen, and you hope they decided to come find you for a good reason rather than a bad one. Daniel, I said, into the dark. Quietly, the way you say a name you found on a voice recorder in a cold storage room when you're not sure how much of it still applies to what's standing there. The silence that followed had a texture to it, a quality I was starting to recognize from the desert. The silence of something that is present and aware and deciding something. Then the voice came back, lower, more careful. That name. Where did you hear it? Not a question. The demand of someone who had not expected to hear it and needed to know the source. Not a question. A demand. Flat and careful, and carrying that accent that didn't belong to any human register I'd grown up with. Your voice recorder, I said. In the long-term storage room, box at the bottom of the 441A shelf. I found it tonight when I was in the facility looking for exactly what I found. Another silence, longer than the first. The vibration in the ground where his movement had been went completely still, like something stepping off a surface and deciding to become the surface. He wasn't shifting weight, wasn't adjusting, standing the way something stands when it has learned not to betray itself through ordinary physical tells. The silence that followed had a weight to it. You were inside, he said finally. You accessed the facility. Still not a question. Processing, not asking. Yes, I said. I copied the files, the whole Project Sandstorm directory. I have everything Dr. Solis has ever written about what we are and what she wants to do with it. A pause. The files. He said it the way you repeat something back when you're deciding how to feel about it and haven't finished deciding yet. I copied them, I said. Everything. Stage breakdowns, external applications, the termination report. I kept my voice steady. Everything she wrote about you and everything she wrote about me, the whole record of what was done and why. I kept my voice even. I know what happened to you in the file. A pause settled between us that had the quality of evaluation, the same quality I'd felt when I extended through the desert floor and read what was moving across it, being read the way I'd been reading things. What did you find? He said. Not what did the files say. What did you find? Asking what I'd understood, not what I'd seen. The distinction felt intentional and worth noting. Everything, I said. Stage breakdowns, external applications, the termination report. A breath. What happened to you? The silence after that was different, heavier, the kind of silence that forms around something that hasn't been spoken about for a long time. What do you think happened to me? He said, and it was such a specific question, not what did the file say, not what did Solis conclude, that I understood he wanted to know what I'd figured out. The file said loss of cohesion, complete cellular disintegration. I kept my voice steady. But you're standing in the desert talking to me. So the file was wrong. The file, he said slowly, was not wrong. It described exactly what happened. It simply drew the wrong conclusion about what that meant. I stayed with that distinction for a moment. Let it settle into the space where it needed to land before I responded to it, because it was the kind of sentence that changed what came after. You dissolved, I said. The way I dissolved in the lab. and then you couldn't reconstitute into what you'd been before. That's what the file described as loss of cohesion. I dissolved, he said, and I couldn't reconstitute into what I had been before. That is a significantly different thing from simply not reconstituting. The file missed the distinction. The desert around me was so quiet I could hear my own breathing, my own heartbeat, ordinary sounds that suddenly felt precious in a way they hadn't 48 hours ago. "What are you now?" I asked. The question came out more directly than I'd intended, with less diplomatic softening. I was tired, and it was past midnight, and I was standing in the Nevada desert across from something that used to be a person. The direct version was the only one that actually mattered here. The movement happened before I'd finished the question. The ground vibrated differently. Not footsteps, something broader, distributed. At the edge of my 40-foot awareness, something touched the desert floor the way a hand touches water, testing it, then entering. Not footsteps, something broader, something distributed across a wider surface area, something moving the way a weather front moves rather than the way a person moves across terrain. He appeared at the edge of what the ambient starlight could reach, and I understood immediately why the vibration in the ground had felt wrong for a person or a vehicle. He wasn't entirely a person anymore. He wasn't not a person either. He occupied some third category that the English language hadn't developed good vocabulary for yet. The shape was roughly human, 2 arms, a head, the general proportions of a standing person. But the surface was wrong. The edges weren't clean. They shifted in the night air, particles detaching and reattaching in a slow, constant cycle, like breathing made visible. He was holding his shape the way I held mine, concentrating, maintaining, keeping the particles in their relationship. The difference was that he had been doing this continuously, without stopping, for 3.5 years, without anyone showing him how. "I am," he said, and the edges of him shifted slightly in the night air. What the protocol produces when no one intervenes, when the compound is allowed to run its full course without interruption. I looked at him, at the edges of him, moving slightly in the desert wind, at the fact that there were no eyes visible in the right way, but something was looking at me from the shape of his face. "They stopped it for me," I said. "Dr. Solis redesigned the compound after you. That's what 441B means, the corrected version, the one she built after learning what happened to you." "She corrected the formula," Daniel said, "so that you wouldn't lose cohesion the way I did, so that you would remain controllable. That is what she corrected, not the outcome, the control. I let that land where it needed to. The distinction between correcting the formula and correcting the outcome, between fixing the control problem and changing what the thing was ultimately for. She still wants the same thing at the end," I said. "The external application section, the geographic dispersion. She just wants a version she can control." Daniel said nothing. In the desert, silence from something with a 1/4-mile awareness radius is a very complete form of confirmation. "She wants what the external applications file describes," Daniel said. "She has always wanted that. I was the version that proved the concept was possible. You are the version she built to actually use it." The wind picked up from the west. I felt it move through the desert around me, through the sand I was reading like a second skin. And I felt Daniel in it too. Particles of him distributed across a radius that dwarfed my 40 feet. Much further. A different scale entirely. "How far can you extend?" I asked. "The radius. When you reach outward into the desert and feel what's there, how far does it go?" I wanted a number, something I could orient myself against. He understood the question without me finishing it. "Currently? Perhaps a 1/4 mile in each direction." A pause. "When I choose to extend fully." "Further. A 1/4 mile. Controlled." After 3.5 years of practicing alone in the Nevada desert, with no protocol, no guidance, no Dr. Solis taking notes. "You figured all of that out yourself," I said. "With no protocol, no guidance, no one taking notes or running assessments or telling you what stage you were in." "Without any of it." "I had time," he said. 3.5 years of it, and I had the clearest possible motivation. I did not want to stop existing. That turns out to be a very effective teacher when nothing else is available. Something in that sentence was the most human thing he'd said since he first spoke my subject number out of the dark. The ordinary human motivation of not wanting to stop existing, stated plainly and without drama by something that had gone significantly beyond ordinary human. "Why did you come back near the facility?" I said. "You've been out here for 3.5 years. Tonight of all the nights you could have chosen. Why tonight, specifically?" "Because you were here," he said. "I felt you in the fence, in the ground, moving through the facility the way I move, which is not the way anyone else moves." It was immediately noticeable. The edges of him shifted slightly, something that might have been the equivalent of a wry expression. "I have not felt another person move that way before. It was noticeable." "How long have you been in the desert?" I said. "Since the termination report, since Blackridge decided you were gone. What have the past 3.5 years actually looked like for you?" "Since 2 weeks after," he said. "I spent 2 weeks in the facility, unable to reconstitute, unable to communicate. They believed I was gone." He paused. "I was not gone. I was learning what I had become. 3.5 years in the Nevada desert, alone, learning to be something with no instruction manual and no precedent, learning to hold a shape, learning to extend and retract, learning to move across terrain as something other than a person walking, learning, in short, everything I had been supposed to be guided through by a protocol Dr. Solis had spent years designing." "You're ahead of me in every stage," I said, "further along than I am, further along than the protocol expected me to be at this point, and you're further along than that by years of solo practice." "Yes," he said. The word carried no pride and no apology, just fact, the clean acknowledgement of something that was true and didn't need to be softened or emphasized. "And you came here tonight," I said, "and you said my subject number into the dark, and you're standing in the Nevada desert talking to me. Which means you came to find me, and I want to know why." "Because you are where I was," he said, 3.5 years ago, and someone should have been there when I was there, should have been there to explain what was happening. No one was. He looked at me in whatever way he looked at things now. "I am not going to let the same thing happen to you that happened to me." I stood in the Nevada dark and felt my 40-foot radius of desert extending around me, and somewhere beyond it, a 1/4-mile radius of something that used to be Daniel Reyes. The only person who could help me navigate what I was becoming was someone the file said was dead. I sat with that for a moment and decided it was the best available option. "What do you need from me?" I said. "If you came to find me specifically, if you felt me in the fence and tracked me across the desert and waited for me outside this facility, you came for a reason." "Nothing," he said. "I need nothing from you. You need things from me. Time, teaching, someone who has already been through the stages and knows where the edges are." "Stage 4, I said. "The control integration, the cognitive dominance over the expanding network. That's where the alpha formula failed. That's where you started to lose the thread of yourself." "That is where the formula lost it," he said. "The alpha formula. I was not built to maintain cognitive dominance over an expanding network. The compound didn't support it." "Yours does," he said. And then, with a pause that had weight in it, the weight of someone choosing precision over comfort. "Theoretically, based on the formula differences, which I could not test directly. Theoretically, a word that does a lot of heavy lifting in a sentence that's supposed to be reassuring. I noted it and set it aside and decided to revisit it when I had more information. "What does it actually look like?" I said carefully. "When someone fails to maintain cognitive dominance, what does that process look like from the inside? What did it look like for you?" "It looks like what the file described," he said. "And then it looks like me. And then, if nothing intervenes, it stops looking like anything at all." I looked at the USB drive in my hand, felt the shape of the voice recorder in my jacket pocket, felt the 40-foot radius of desert around me, alive and present and listening. And then I looked at Daniel, at the shape of him, the edges that moved, the presence that extended across a 1/4 mile of Nevada desert in every direction from where he stood. "I have a cousin," I said. "His name is Marcus. He's waiting about a mile south of here in a converted van, and he helped me get to the facility tonight, and he is going to have questions." "I know about your cousin," Daniel said. "I felt the van arrive approximately 2 hours ago. I've been aware of it since it parked." A pause. He did not move from the vehicle. He is patient. Of course he did. Of course, Daniel Reyes, who had spent 3.5 years as a quarter-mile radius of desert awareness, had felt a van park 2 hours ago and been tracking it since. Marcus is going to have a lot of questions, I said. I'm going to have to explain what you are and what I am, and what's in these files, and what we're planning to do about all of it. Everyone will have questions, Daniel said. His voice in the dark had the quality of someone who had spent 3 years alone, thinking carefully about exactly this. That is not the central problem. Blackridge is the central problem, and Dr. Solis will move faster than you expect. Dr. Solis will know by morning that someone was in her office. She will know what was taken, and she will understand exactly what that means for her timeline. She'll accelerate the timeline when she realizes what's missing, I said. She'll know someone was in her office. She'll understand what getting those files outside the facility means for the project. She will do more than accelerate, he said. When I disappeared, she spent 8 months searching before concluding I'd dispersed fully and ceased to exist. The edges of him shifted. She was wrong. She will not make the same mistake twice. She will not stop looking for you. So she'll be looking for me, I said, and eventually for you, if she figures out that 441A wasn't actually terminated, which is going to change the whole shape of what she thinks she's dealing with. She will be looking for you, he said. She does not know I exist. That is an advantage we have exactly once, and we should not waste it standing in the facility's range. He looked east into the dark beyond the perimeter. We should move. Bring your cousin. What I need to show you takes more than one night. I looked south toward where Marcus was waiting, then at Daniel, at the shape of him, the edges that moved, the presence that spread across a quarter-mile of Nevada in every direction, then at the drive. Then at my own hands, solid, present, containing somewhere in whatever my cells had become the potential for a quarter-mile radius and beyond. 4 stages of a protocol I was already running ahead of schedule with no safety net, guided by someone the facility thought was a terminated experiment. Okay, I said. Give me 10 minutes to get to the van and explain the situation to Marcus. Well, explain the parts of the situation that are explainable in 10 minutes. Some of it will need more time. I'll be in the ground, Daniel said, plainly, as a statement of location. And then he simply wasn't there. The shape dissolved inward, and the space where he'd stood was just the Nevada desert again. The shape dissolved inward and downward, and the desert floor in that direction felt briefly denser, more present, inhabited, and then felt like desert again. Just desert. I stood alone in the Nevada dark for 30 seconds, breathed in the desert air, felt the ground beneath my feet and the 40-foot radius around me, and the recorder in my jacket pocket. My name is Kai. I'm 23 years old. I'm from a town with no traffic lights. My mom worked double shifts. I have a USB drive full of classified files, a dead man's voice recorder in my jacket, and a new teacher somewhere in the ground beneath my feet. This is what the situation looks like. I started walking south, 1 foot, then the other, in the direction of where Marcus was parked, with his lights off and his coffee and his 3-person supply kit and his complete patience. The van's lights were off. Marcus had turned them off because Marcus planned for things like being visible from a distance when you're waiting for someone who might be followed. I thought about Dr. Solis's coffee mug and what the external application section said I would eventually be capable of. I thought about the difference between a weapon and a person, and whether that line was something you could hold on to when you were already running ahead of the schedule that was supposed to manage it. I thought about Daniel saying she corrected the control, not the outcome, and about what that meant for what I was being built toward. And I thought about one more thing, something that had been sitting in the back of my mind since the storage room, since the voice recorder, since Daniel Reyes said, "I'm saying this so something knows," and about what it meant that the files were now outside and in my hands. Journalists exist. Lawyers exist. Information outside a classified facility, in the right hands, becomes very difficult to put back in a box. The termination report that was wrong, the external applications section that had changed how I understood what I was being built toward, the voice recorder, Daniel saying, "I'm saying this so something knows," all of it now outside the box it had been kept in. I had a cousin who planned for 3 people, a lawyer who asked very few questions. A contact who had survived 3.5 years alone in the Nevada desert. Blackridge had designed a weapon. They had not accounted for the possibility that the weapon would have a support network, a moral position, a cousin with a topographic map, and a USB drive. I knew journalists exist. I knew lawyers exist. Marcus had a lawyer's number on a scrap of paper, and she asked very few questions, which meant she was exactly the right kind. Information outside a classified facility and in the right hands becomes something very difficult to put back. That was the principle. That was the plan. Blackridge had built me to be a delivery system, a dispersible weapon, something that could cover square miles. They had not built me to have a human soul and a cousin with a topographic map and a USB drive full of their own files. Blackridge had designed me to be a weapon and had not accounted for the possibility that the weapon would have a family and a moral compass and access to a USB port. That felt like an oversight. The lights of Marcus's van were visible through the scrub. Off, which was correct. He was exactly where I'd left him, engine off, windows down. Waiting with the particular patience of someone who has decided to trust a plan and is not going to undermine it by doing anything before the person they're waiting for arrives. The van was where I'd left it. Marcus was in the driver's seat with the engine off and a cup of coffee from somewhere that shouldn't have been possible to obtain in the middle of the Nevada desert. He looked at me for a second, then at the USB drive in my hand, then at something in my face that I couldn't see but he apparently could read clearly. "How bad is it?" Marcus said, setting his coffee down in the cup holder with the careful motion of someone who has been waiting a long time and is now trying to gauge exactly how much to brace for. "Complicated?" I said. "I found what I went in for. I also found something I hadn't gone in looking for, which is usually either very good news or very bad news, and this one is genuinely both." "That's a useful distinction," Marcus said. "Break it down for me. Good complicated as in we have more resources than expected, or bad complicated as in more people are involved than we planned for." "Give me the version that lets me calibrate," Marcus said. "Those two kinds of complicated require different responses, and I'd like to know which one I'm actually preparing for right now." I thought about Daniel in the ground somewhere to our north, the quarter-mile radius, 3.5 years of solo practice with no protocol and no guidance, about stage 4 and cognitive dominance, and what it meant that the only person who could teach me how to survive it was someone Blackridge thought was terminated. About the voice recorder saying, "I'm saying this so something knows." About being here now, in a van moving north, with someone who had decided to show up. "Both," I said, "simultaneously. There is someone else involved who is on our side, and not on Blackridge's side, and the reason that's complicated is what they are, and how they got there." Marcus looked at the windshield for a moment, processed, then looked back at me, with the expression he used when he'd already run 3 steps ahead of the conversation. "Is there someone else coming?" "What makes you ask that?" I said, which was partly genuine curiosity and partly buying myself 2 seconds to figure out how to explain the situation in the parking lot of a Nevada desert rendezvous point. "Because," Marcus said very carefully, "the ground under this van has been doing something for the past 3 minutes that ground does not normally do. I grew up camping," he added, in the tone of someone presenting a credential. "I have spent significant time paying attention to what ground normally does. This is categorically not that." I pressed my foot lightly against the floor and extended downward through the chassis, through the undercarriage, into the ground beneath the van. Still, patient, waiting with the specific patience of something that had spent 3.5 years learning exactly how to wait. Daniel Reyes, or what had become of Daniel Reyes over 3.5 years of solo survival in the Nevada desert, was directly underneath the van. Patient, waiting to be introduced. "Yes," I said, "there is someone else. He's going to come in through the back door in approximately 30 seconds, and I need you to not react the way your instincts are going to tell you to react." Marcus looked at me for one long moment. Then he reached into the back seat, produced a paper bag, and set it on the center console between us without a word and without breaking eye contact. "I planned for 3, he said. "Standard protocol for situations I don't fully understand. always account for one more than you're expecting. He looked at the back seat. Is the third going to fit? I looked at my cousin, at the person who lived in a van by choice and kept topographic maps in his jacket and had a lawyer on speed dial for exactly this category of situation. Marcus. Yeah, he said, in the tone that meant he'd already partially figured it out and was waiting for me to catch up to where he was. When this is over, I'm going to think very carefully about what kind of planning goes into preparing for 3 people when only 2 were expected. You do that, Marcus said. He started the engine, left it in park, and waited, hands loose on the steering wheel, in the way that meant he had genuinely decided to see what happened next. I rolled down the window, let the desert air come in, felt it move through me and around me and across the 40 feet of Nevada that was, in some way I was still learning to understand, also me. Daniel, I said, not loud. Just to the ground under the van and the air around it, and whatever radius of desert was currently occupied by something that used to be Daniel Reyes and now was something more. A pause. Then the passenger side back door opened from the outside, which it definitely should not have been able to do from outside a locked van. Something that was mostly the shape of a person settled into the back seat with the careful deliberateness of something that had been practicing looking like a person for 3.5 years. Marcus looked in the rear-view mirror at the shape in the back seat. His hands stayed exactly where they were on the steering wheel. He didn't drive. He didn't speak. He was processing. Hi, Marcus said finally to the back seat, in the voice he used when he was determined to be normal about something that was not remotely normal and had decided that was the correct approach. Hello, Daniel said. His voice in the enclosed space of the van was different than it had been in the open desert, more present, more contained, still carrying that accent of learned from outside. Marcus looked at me. I looked at Marcus. The kind of look that passes between 2 people who grew up in the same family and have reached a point where words aren't particularly necessary. Okay, Marcus said. One word. The word of someone who has completed an assessment and reached a conclusion and is now simply proceeding with what needs to happen next. He put the van in drive. The Nevada desert opened up as we pulled onto the dirt road. Stars above. Dark, flat terrain in every direction. 3 people in a converted van moving north, away from Blackridge, away from Dr. Solis's carefully organized office and her 4-year timeline and everything she'd planned that we were now outside of. I pressed my palm flat against the passenger door and felt the desert passing under the wheels, rock and sand and ancient geological formations running backward at 50 miles an hour. Somewhere behind us, Blackridge Research Facility sat lit against the dark, full of monitors and files, and a project that had been building towards something for 4.5 years. Somewhere in Dr. Solis's office, a monitor had gone to sleep on a folder that was now completely empty. She would find that in the morning. The timeline of what happened after that was something to plan for. And somewhere in the ground we just left, the desert remembered being someone for a few minutes and then let it go. Particles returning to particles. Shape returning to no shape. The boundary between Daniel Reyes and the Nevada desert settling back to something that looked, from the outside, exactly like ordinary sand. Except it wasn't ordinary sand anymore. Not the sand near the facility, not the sand in a 40-foot radius around wherever I happened to be standing. Maybe not any of it, once Daniel had been through it. I reached into my jacket pocket and felt the voice recorder. Small, plastic, ordinary-looking object containing the voice of a 20-year-old from El Paso who had been afraid and had said so out loud. I'm saying this so something knows. That was what he'd said, into the recorder, into the silence of a room he'd been alone in. Something knew now. I knew. Daniel, in the back seat, knew I knew. Something knew I knew. The recording existed outside the storage room it had been buried in. That felt like something. Not everything, not enough, but a place to stand while figuring out what came after. The van headlights pushed into the dark ahead. Marcus drove without asking where we were going, which was the right call because we didn't fully know yet. Daniel sat in the back seat, mostly quiet, and occasionally extended a hand toward the window to feel the desert moving past at 50 miles an hour. I watched the stars and thought about stage 4, about cognitive dominance, about what I was going to need to hold on to as the network expanded, about the distance between Kai and the storm that Kai was becoming, and how to keep that distance from closing all the way. I thought about Daniel saying no one was there when I was where you are now, and about the specific decision it represented that he was here now in the back seat of a van moving north, and about the fact that he was there now, in the back seat, which meant that out of everything the past 3.5 years could have made him, it had made him someone who showed up. I thought about what Dr. Solis had spent 4 years building, and what it meant that the thing she'd built had a human soul, one that had grown up in a town with no traffic lights and still remembered being hungry and scared and 19 and signing a contract for the Zeros. The thing about building a weapon is that weapons don't have memories. They don't have cousins who plan for 3 people just in case. They don't stand in cold storage rooms listening to dead men's voice recorders and feel the weight of being alive because someone else isn't. Dr. Solis had spent 4 years building something extraordinary. She just hadn't built what she thought she'd built. The gap between those two things was going to be her problem and our advantage. I was going to make absolutely sure, at some point, in some way, with the USB drive and the lawyer and whatever else turned out to be available, that she understood the difference clearly. The van moved north through the Nevada dark, 3 people and a USB drive and a plan that was still being assembled from available materials, which is the only way any real plan ever gets made. The desert moved with us as we drove, spreading outward in every direction from the van, alive and present and continuous in a way that I could feel through the door and the floor and the seat beneath me. One vast connected thing that had room in it for what used to be Daniel Reyes and what used to be just Kai, and was becoming something else in the space between those two identities. We drove north until the cluster of lights that was Black Ridge Research Facility curved behind the horizon and disappeared. Marcus drove. Daniel was quiet. I watched the stars, and then we kept driving, because there was road ahead of us, and the road was going somewhere that wasn't behind us, and that was the only criteria that mattered right now, because that's how it starts, not with the ending, with the next thing, and the thing after that, and all the open ground still ahead of you in the dark. Ready or not, which is the condition everything actually starts under, if you're honest about it. Nobody is ever fully ready. They just decide to go anyway. We went.